Lo único que me queda es escribir esta carta para mí misma, con la esperanza de que algún día la puedas leer cuando la pesadilla que estamos viviendo esté en un pasado distante. Te quiero mucho, Victoria.
Radio República.
Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Vicky. And thank you very much, everyone. I'll now translate Vicky's remarks into English. First of all, today I want to thank Jared and Michael for having been with us this last year, and for the press for having covered this tragedy since the very beginning. And I want to thank my friends and family for having given me the strength to continue. I have only been able to continue through this year with my daughter in mind, so that she can live in a future that is better than the one we're living now. I want to say to Daniel Ortega, give me my husband back. Give my daughter her mother back. This has been a year of unimaginable pain. In every place and in every moment, I am thinking about how my husband is. And like Jared said, we have not seen or heard from him in one complete year. After nearly 3 months of being disappeared, we were asking for proof of life. Then it has been months of not knowing how he is. It's been more than a month since we've heard from him the last time. This is not a political topic. This is a humanitarian topic. More than 180 people are held, suffering torture, and all of their families outside are suffering too. Enough is enough. This has to end. I express my solidarity to the rest of the families that are suffering under these inhuman conditions, and I hope that my voice today helps to bring about the liberty of more than 180 political prisoners in my country. Even though I have not seen you or heard from you all this time, I want to read you a letter from our daughter. This is the text of the letter. Dad. Today I would write you a letter telling you about myself. About everything that has happened to me since last June. I would tell you how things went in my first year at university, how it feels to live abroad, and how much I miss Nicaragua. I would tell you how proud I am of all that you have done, and in all of the lessons that you have taught me. I would try to raise your spirits, to tell you a joke or a fun story. But my words ring hollow, because today I cannot read you this letter. You are in a cell, unjustly deprived of your liberty. It has now been a year since any kind of communication between us, a year without having seen you or heard your voice. The only thing I can do is write this letter with all of myself in the hope that one day you can read it and learn about the nightmare that we have lived from in the very distant past. I love you very much. Victoria.
Radio República.
Gracias, Vicky. Te mando un abrazo. Es sumamente difícil hablar en estas circunstancias. Hoy que se conmemora un año de este secuestro ilegal de nuestros esposos y de más de 180 personas que están ahora presas políticas en Nicaragua. Y como bien Vicky decía, yo también quiero agradecer al equipo de abogados que nos ha acompañado tanto fuera de Nicaragua como en Nicaragua, tantos defensores que todos los días se arriesgan para tratar de defender a nuestros familiares en Nicaragua. Gracias a Jared y a Michael también, porque han sido fundamentales para poder alzar nuestras voces y denunciar lo que está pasando en Nicaragua. Vicky y a Victoria, quiero decirles que pronto podrán reunirse con Juan Sebastián, y esto mismo se lo digo a cada uno de los familiares. Sabemos que ha sido una lucha que no debió haber ocurrido, porque lo único que nuestros esposos trataban era de restablecer la democracia, establecer justicia y libertad en nuestro país. Gracias a todas las personas también que durante todo este año nos han acompañado, nos han ayudado, brindándonos diferentes herramientas, escenarios, espacios para alzar nuestras voces. Gracias a las personas que nos han escuchado. Gracias a los tomadores de decisión que han estado beligerantes, dando seguimiento a la situación de Nicaragua, y esperamos que así continúen hasta lograr el restablecimiento de la democracia y la libertad. Hoy desperté pensando en lo lindo que va a ser este reencuentro, en lo lindo que va a ser contarle a Félix lo incansable que ha sido el pueblo nicaragüense en la búsqueda de su libertad. Va a ser lindo contarle cómo yo, como su esposa, he aprendido tanto sobre un tema que a él tanto le ha apasionado, como son los derechos humanos. Va a ser lindo contarle cómo Alejandra siempre fue valiente, a pesar de que a su corta edad no entiende con claridad por qué su papá todavía no está con ella. Va a ser lindo contarle cómo su madre, doña Carmen Blandón, estuvo siempre orando por él día a día y siguiendo las noticias de lo que ocurría en el país. Y sé que ese momento va a ser un momento donde no solamente nosotros como familia vamos a recibir lo que nos hemos merecido, que es estar juntos, pero también va a ser un momento de esperanza para Nicaragua. Y ese es el mensaje que yo quiero dejar hoy. Hoy es un día más de que mi esposo está encarcelado injustamente, pero también es un día más cerca de su libertad. Mi solidaridad para cada uno de los familiares de las personas presas políticas, mi solidaridad para las personas que han sido víctimas de la represión del Estado de Nicaragua, y espero que pronto logremos tener ese país por el cual estamos esforzándonos y empeñándonos en luchar. Y para finalizar, solamente quiero leer un poema que Félix escribió hace muchos años en realidad, y que ahora suenan como que fueran palabras actuales. Este poema habla sobre la libertad y es una reflexión que creo que su intimidad hacía durante estaba orando, y dice así: dijiste, la verdad te hará libre. ¿Es cierto entonces que algún día encontraré la libertad? Busqué la libertad como un niño desesperado por capturar una luciérnaga. Anhelaba la libertad igual que las almas solitarias anhelaban el amor. Ahora busco libertad como un hombre sin hogar en una noche de invierno que anhela refugio. Pero la luciérnaga, el amor y el refugio solo llegarán si puedes oírme. Por favor, no tardes demasiado en escuchar. La noche es fría y me estoy congelando. Cuando llegue el amanecer, puede que no tenga voz. Félix Maradiaga, octubre del 2012. Encontrando libertad. Y hoy tomo sus palabras para hacer un llamado a la comunidad internacional, al pueblo nicaragüense y al régimen de Daniel Ortega y Rosario Murillo. Es momento de volver humana.
Muchas gracias, Berta. Now I will translate Berta's remarks into English. First of all, I want to thank Vicky and send her a hug from afar. It is very difficult to speak in these circumstances, but especially on a day like today where we mark the 1-year anniversary of the arrest of Félix Maradiaga. I want to thank our legal teams that have stood with us from Nicaragua and from outside, from abroad, helping us to defend our husbands and to raise our voices. Vicky, we will together be with our husbands and all of the other families reunited very soon. Our husbands want nothing more than to establish freedom, democracy, and human rights in our country. Thank you to everyone over the last year who has given us a space to raise our voice, and to all of the decision makers that have heard us and have raised their voices on our behalf. Today, I woke up thinking about how beautiful it would be to have this space together and to tell you about Félix and our dreams, how it would be lovely to tell you about how our daughter Alejandra has been so brave over the last year, the nightmare that we have lived, about how his mother, Doña Carmen, has been so brave too, praying for him, and even though she reads the terrible things that are happening in the news. It's obviously very difficult to do that, but despite all of this, I feel nevertheless that this is a moment of hope. It is one more day that they are in prison, yes, but it is one more day closer to the day that they will be free. And then soon we will indeed have the country that we have dreamt of for so long. Berta read a poem that Félix wrote many years ago in 2002, and she takes his words and transforms those words into a call to the international community and to Daniel Ortega, Rosario, Murillo, and those in Nicaragua that are holding them captive in a plea for the freedom of all the political prisoners in Nicaragua. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Berta, you got cut off and rejoined. Is there anything else you wanted to conclude with? Or do you want to leave it there for now?
Thank you, Jared. Bye.
Well, thank you, Vicky and Berta, on behalf of Michael and myself, who've had the honor and the privilege of working with you over the last year. I think it's worth noting, as everyone can see, the extraordinary grace and courage and dignity with which you have undertook this fight against Daniel Ortega and his regime, not just for your husbands and your daughters, but for all the people of Nicaragua who are trapped in the country in one very large prison and are afraid to say anything or do anything against the regime for fear that they will be next to be disappeared and imprisoned. All of us are here because of you, the two of you, and because of the courage that you've had over this last year to speak truth to power, to speak out relentlessly against Daniel Ortega and his regime. And it bears noting as well that that you have not just been enormously effective as spokespeople for the political prisoners of Nicaragua, but you've both been directly targeted by Daniel Ortega and his regime in a wide array of ways, and indeed also been labeled without any due process of law as traitors to the homeland. And so neither of you can even return back to Nicaragua without legitimate and substantial fear of being arrested and imprisoned yourselves. Let's now open it up to questions. We've got a number of different people on this call, but if we can start with journalists, working journalists. If you have a question for Vicky, Berta, or myself, you can either drop it into the chat box or you can just raise your hand and we will call on you to ask a question.
Muchas gracias a todos por su participación y asistencia a la conferencia de prensa de hoy. Vamos a trasladar a la sesión de preguntas y respuestas. Si ustedes tienen una pregunta para nosotros, para Jared como abogado internacional o como las esposas Berta y Vicky, por favor, vamos a comenzar con periodistas, pero después con cualquier otra persona que está aquí en la llamada. Si tiene pregunta, por favor, póngala en el chat. O si puede también levantar la mano. Identifíquense, por favor, y después con mucho gusto podemos contestar la pregunta. Gracias.
Is there someone who would like to begin? Let me just begin by throwing a question to Vicky and to Berta. To ask them a question. Actually, we've got a hand raised here from Noel Miranda. So let's start with Noel first. I'll come back to my question.
Radio República.
Noel, adelante, por favor.
Sí, buenos días. Buenos días.
Buenos días, le oigo.
Sí, para el abogado Jared Jensen. Él decía al inicio de su texto que es difícil de creer que haya pasado un año completo de que Juan y Félix fueron detenidos y califica al régimen de Ortega como una dictadura brutal. ¿Qué más se ha hecho para legalmente en lo legal para demandar la libertad no solamente de Juan Sebastián Chamorro, de Félix, sino de los 180 presos políticos.
Muchas gracias, Noel, por la pregunta. Jared, this first question is for you. You said at the very beginning of your speech, you characterized the Ortega regime as a brutal dictatorship and said it's very hard to believe that it's been a full year since they were detained. Can you tell us what else at the legal level can be done to demand the freedom for not only Juan Sebastián and Félix, but for all of the political prisoners?
Well, obviously, if we had any quick and easy solutions, we would have undertaken them at this stage. I mean, I think that the only way forward is to put enormous pressure from every direction possible on the Ortega regime, and for there to be consequences, serious consequences for the regime and for Daniel Ortega and his wife. And the vice president personally as well. I think that we have seen some signs that they are feeling the pressure from all these different directions. Some of the things that we're doing privately and behind the scenes. We can't speak publicly about everything that we're doing. But I will say that despite the world's focus on Ukraine right now, there are a range of actions being undertaken by the United States, by the EU, by other countries in the region to make very clear that there will be serious consequences if the situation persists. I think it was a big victory when a few months ago the UN Human Rights Council created a commission of inquiry, referred to as a panel of human rights experts that have been charged with conducting an objective assessment of what is actually happening in Nicaragua, based on evidence gathering and analysis that would be undertaken. And I think that is an important step forward for documenting and reporting on the gross human rights abuses that are taking place, and that will create its own momentum for further action coming from there. So I think that our view is that we need a system-wide approach, global system-wide approach to addressing the impunity with which the Ortega regime is operating. Actions from the UN, from the OAS, from individual governments like the United States, the European Union, and other individual member states in the broader Latin American region and countries in Europe and beyond. I think all of that is very, very important, and we need to maintain the focus and pressure on Ortega despite the distractions that the Ukraine war has provided for dictatorships like the Ortega regime that are trying to fly under the radar. But I think the best sign that what we're doing is having an effect is the fact of the news reports that we have seen about how members of the Ortega regime, Rosario and Murillo, one of his sons, have been reaching out to the United States to try to engage in dialogue. If they were confident in their position, and if they felt that there was no real meaningful pressure that was being placed on them, they would not engage in outreach to the United States or to any other country or region of the world. They would just sit at home and condemn any attempt to engage with them, and clearly the fact that they are proactively reaching out to people around the world about what's going on demonstrates that our collective actions are having an effect. Not a sufficient effect yet, obviously. We haven't seen the release of political prisoners, but I think that should only encourage us to redouble our efforts and to increase the pressure on the regime going forward.
Thank you, Jared. Para responder a la pregunta, pues obviamente no es una solución que es fácil, pero la solución que creemos nosotros que sería lo mejor es para ampliar la presión de cada dirección posible, para hacerlo evidente que sería consecuencia para acciones así. Hemos visto señales que los del régimen están sintiendo la presión internacionalmente, pero a pesar del foco internacional en la situación en Ucrania, hay una variedad de acciones que gobiernos democráticos en la región, como los Estados Unidos, la Unión Europea, la ONU, que puedan hacer para hacer claro que sí va a ser consecuencia serio por este tipo de comportamiento autocrático. Por ejemplo, el Consejo de Derechos Humanos de la ONU en marzo aprobó un panel de expertos para evaluar la situación en Nicaragua, y eso creemos nosotros es un paso importante, un paso adelante. Nuestra perspectiva es que necesitamos una estrategia global, sistemático, para abordar la impunidad, acciones también concretas, coordinadas de las Naciones Unidas, de la Organización de Estados Americanos, de gobiernos individuales, para mantener el foco en la situación, para que la impunidad del régimen no persista así. Y hemos visto que estos tipos de acciones sí tienen un efecto. Muchas gracias. Berta, ¿quiere agregar algo? Está en mute.
Lo que mencionó Jared es muy acertado, ¿no? Creemos que la comunidad internacional ha establecido diferentes mecanismos, acuerdos internacionales a los cuales el Estado de Nicaragua está adscrito y debe respetar. Pero también quiero mencionar, y es algo muy importante, el hecho que la ciudadanía nicaragüense tiene también el mismo objetivo, que es la liberación y el resguardo de la integridad y la vida de las personas presas políticas dentro y fuera del país. Y recientemente la gran mayoría de familiares nos sumamos a este llamado también de las fuerzas nacionales, ¿no? De todos los actores en Nicaragua, sea el sector privado, las iglesias, la sociedad civil, que todavía queda poca, pero queda dentro del país, así como toda la oposición que se encuentra en el exilio. Y hicimos este llamado también para reiterar la urgencia que hay de salvaguardar la vida de las personas presas políticas. Y yo creo que ese llamado también es muy importante, porque aquí estamos viendo una unanimidad, no solamente de la comunidad internacional bajo estas regulaciones internacionales, pero también del pueblo de Nicaragua, demandando la liberación de las personas presas políticas y de la restitución de la democracia y las libertades en nuestro país. Y insisto, y no terminé de decir la frase, este llamado es para todos. O sea, tenemos que acabar con esta violencia sistemática en la cual hemos estado inmersos y hemos estado sufriendo. Es momento, como decía Victoria, basta ya. Necesitamos que comience a existir un Estado de Derecho en Nicaragua, para que las personas puedan retornar sin ser agredidas, para que las personas puedan participar de los espacios públicos sin sufrir tantos riesgos. Ese es nuestro llamado, es humanizar la situación que estamos viviendo en nuestro país.
Gracias, Berta. I will just briefly translate for those on the call that do not speak Spanish. It's important to emphasize that the Nicaraguan people have the same objective, which is the freedom of the political prisoners, the Nicaraguan people both living in the country and those abroad living in exile. That's why there has been such a strong call from the families of the political prisoners for institutions in the country like civil society, the church, NGOs, and others to prioritize saving the lives of the political prisoners. Once the political prisoners are safe and well and released, we can then proceed with the return to democracy and human rights that is the shared goal of the Nicaraguan people. Like Vicky said, this is enough. Enough is enough. There needs to be a return to rule of law in our country, and our call is to humanize the situation, the grave situation that's happening with the political prisoners.
Michael, do you want to just read and translate the question that's in the chat group?
Yes.
I'm sorry, Vicky, go ahead.
Yo quería agregar de lo que dijo Jared, que la Corte Interamericana de Derechos Humanos se pronunció. La Corte Interamericana ordenó la liberación inmediata de mi esposo y resto de presos políticos. Y también ha dicho que la incomunicación en la que se encuentran los prisioneros es inhumana y denigrante. Y el Estado de Nicaragua ha hecho caso omiso a este llamado de liberación inmediata. Gracias.
Gracias, Vicky. just to add one thing on the topic of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, which the Inter-American system has been quite engaged, I will just add, throughout this process, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights has reiterated its call for the freedom of the political prisoners, including Juan, Félix, and others, noting that the circumstances under which they're detained are seriously grave and worsening, deteriorating, but that also the Ortega regime has been absent with respect to the ongoing process of the Inter-American system, the Inter-American Court. They haven't engaged in any substantive fashion. So the Inter-American Court reiterated the demand that all the political prisoners be free. Gracias, Vicky. And then there is one question in the chat in Spanish. ¿Cómo impacta que se aborde el tema de las violaciones a los derechos humanos entre países, Cuba, Nicaragua y Venezuela, para las gestiones de la liberación de los detenidos, de la accesión de derechos humanos de la prensa? In English, this is a question from the human rights section at La Prensa. What impact can it have trying to confront the very similar human rights circumstances or challenges in Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela? How can trying to challenge those dynamics help in the effort to gain the liberation of all political prisoners?
Let me perhaps ask Vicky or Berta to speak to that, because I know they've been engaging in some conversations with the families of other political prisoners. My own brief comment on that would be simply that those three governments have a similar pattern of repression that they impose on their own local populations, and the governments of Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba work very closely together and collaborate and coordinate their efforts and support each other substantially. And so it's important to understand that the dynamics that take place within the Latin American region, where dictatorships of similar stripes work closely together and collaborate openly in a wide array of contexts in order to learn from each other and to support each other. And this is why it's so important that on the other side of that same equation, that the political prisoners of each of these countries understand the interrelationship between these governments or these regimes, and why it's so important to be fighting them, not just individually and in relation to the political prisoners of any one country, but collectively trying to challenge the repression of these regimes, more broadly.
Gracias, Jared. I will just translate very quickly. Como respuesta corta, es importante reconocer que los tres gobiernos, los tres regímenes de Cuba, Venezuela y Nicaragua, tienen patrones similares de represión. Los tres colaboran mucho y apoyan en sí mismos. Y también es importante entender esta dinámica donde los dictadores trabajan muy de cerca para apoyar en sí mismos. Por esta razón es también igualmente importante que como nosotros del otro lado reconocemos esta dinámica y responder como tal. Berta o Vicky, yo no sé si tienen algo para agregar.
No, gracias, Nico.
Si no, podemos proceder con la siguiente pregunta. Si alguien más tiene una pregunta, periodista, alguien de la sociedad civil, otro participante que está aquí en la discusión. Noel, otra vez. A ustedes, la prensa.
Hola, aquí nuevamente esta pregunta para doña Victoria o Berta. Son 365 días donde los familiares se han expresado a través de comunicados o conferencias como esta. Han considerado, bueno, en Nicaragua cabe señalar que está condenada de cierto modo la protesta cívica. Ortega ha criminalizado la protesta, pero es suficiente para mover a una dictadura donde se instauró y tienen planes de llegar a 5 años más. Una protesta o un comunicado mueve el piso, por así decirlo, a un régimen que Más bien, en vez de liberar presos políticos, 2 murieron en las cárceles, uno en 2019 y otro este año, y en vez de sacar, ha metido más presos, como Yurán Suazo y ahora un sacerdote católico. ¿Qué otras estrategias están utilizando los familiares de presos políticos para seguir demandando justicia? Ayer UPPN, una organización de presos políticos, decía que está en manos de se depende de la comunidad internacional. Otros difieren de ellos. ¿Qué opinan? ¿Esto realmente está en manos de la comunidad internacional? ¿Son ellos los que deben de demandar justicia en Nicaragua? Gracias.
Yo te quisiera contestar, Noel, diciendo de que esto, como dije anteriormente, esto no es un tema político, esto es un tema humanitario. Son seres humanos inocentes sufriendo tortura. Entonces, Berta y yo, lo que hemos tratado de hacer este año es visibilizar las duras condiciones, inhumanas condiciones que sufren nuestros esposos y el resto de presos políticos en Nicaragua. Y nuestro llamado a la comunidad internacional, a la sociedad civil, a los defensores de derechos humanos, al empresariado, es que nos ayuden a lograr esta liberación. Porque estas personas cada día en esas celdas, su salud se deteriora y sus vidas corren peligro. Gracias.
I'll just translate that exchange very quickly. The last question, briefly in summary, was after 365 days of detention where the families of political prisoners have been making pronouncements like this and press conference like this, in short, is that enough? Because protests and things like that are criminalized by the regime inside. What other strategies do the families of the political prisoners have in order to gain their freedom? And Vicky, in response, said this, as I have said previously, is not a political topic, it's a humanitarian topic. What we have tried to do over the last year is make visible the situation in Nicaragua and what we are living through. And at the same time, we have asked everyone that hears us that they do everything that they can to stand with us in this process. It's not political, it's humanitarian. Gracias, Vicky.
And I would just emphasize again that while, in an open and public press conference, we can speak to the generalities of what is happening and make general calls for support. We have a much more focused and targeted set of asks when we meet with various officials of the United Nations, of the OAS, of the EU, of individual governments as well. Obviously, we can't get into our specific strategy and what our specific asks are by virtue of the way that the Ortega regime treats anybody who speaks out publicly in any specific ways about what they're calling for others to do. But I can assure everyone that we are engaging in ongoing and regular conversations with key policymakers who have the ability to have an influence on the Ortega regime and to put pressure on the Ortega regime. And we will continue to press for further action in all the various places that we can get it from until the political prisoners of Nicaragua are released. Daniel Ortega is determined to hold on to power by any means necessary, and obviously within the constraints of what the law requires, we are going to engage in relentless advocacy on behalf of Félix, Juan Sebastián, and all of Nicaragua's political prisoners until they are freed and reunited with their families. And this is, as I think he said, a human rights imperative. We're not here to talk politics. Yes, indeed, the Ortega regime is very political in what it does and how it treats those who dare to speak out against it. But advancing the human rights of the political prisoners of Nicaragua is not a political cause, it's a human rights and humanitarian cause. And, what not only Félix and Juan Sebastián, but what their families have suffered through over this past year constitutes torture as well as cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment or punishment. And as a matter of human dignity and fundamental rights and freedoms, the families of Vicky and Berta and and Juan Sebastián deserve to be reunited, and all of the families of Nicaragua's some 180 plus political prisoners deserve to be reunited with their loved ones. That is the only humanitarian way forward. And there shouldn't be any need, for example, to negotiate for the release of political prisoners. They should not have been taken into custody in the first place, and there is no real basis for them to continue to be held. And therefore, we call, of course, on the Ortega regime and Ortega himself to immediately and unconditionally release all political prisoners of Nicaragua. And until that happens, we're going to work through every organization, every government, every channel we possibly can to put enormous pressure on the regime to ensure that there are serious consequences for them individually and for the regime collectively if it maintains this unsustainable path.
Thank you, Jared. I will just translate into Spanish very briefly. En una conferencia de prensa así, pública, abierta, podemos hablar ampliamente sobre nuestros esfuerzos, lo que estamos haciendo sobre la estrategia, pero no podemos discutir como específicamente cosas que vamos a hacer en nuestra estrategia. Pero por supuesto queremos asegurar a todos los que están aquí en la llamada que estamos en contacto constante con tomadores de decisiones sobre discusiones así para alentar acciones más adelante en nombre de los presos políticos. Ortega quiere mantenerse en el poder para siempre, pero como nosotros vamos a hacer todo lo que podemos hacer para lograr la libertad de todos los presos políticos. Como dijo la Vicky, no es una pregunta de política, pero es solamente de derechos humanos y humanitaria. Este trato así constituye una forma de tortura, no hay un base para detenerlo porque son inocentes, y como siempre reiteramos nuestra llamado al régimen para liberar a todos los presos políticos, incluso Juan y Félix, y en lo interino vamos a hacer todo lo posible, todo lo que podemos hacer nosotros para ampliar la presión en el régimen para lograr su libertad. Gracias.
Are there any final questions? Any questions that remain unanswered at this point? We are going to post this online on YouTube, and we'll circulate that on my Twitter account, and Vicky and Berta will do the same, so we'll make that available. But any final questions?
Antes de concluir, yo no sé si hay otra pregunta antes de terminar con la conferencia de prensa. Estamos grabando la conferencia y después va a ser disponible en YouTube, también en Twitter después, más tarde. Pero si alguien tiene una otra pregunta o comentario antes de concluir la conferencia, por favor, adelante.
Mientras tanto, yo quisiera agregar algo que hemos insistido los familiares. Mientras se da la liberación incondicional de nuestros seres queridos, exigimos al Estado de Nicaragua respetar las condiciones mínimas en las cuales se deben de resguardar a las personas prisioneras políticas, y estamos hablando de las reglas Mandelas. Por otra parte, también quisiera hacer un llamado a los medios de comunicación, agradecerles por ese trabajo incansable que hacen, y a la comunidad internacional a que nos acompañen, a que nos ayuden a elevar nuestras voces, a que nos ayuden a difundir lo que está pasando en Nicaragua. Somos un país pequeño, a veces nos abruma tantas situaciones a nivel global que están ocurriendo, pero pedirles que conservemos en la agenda mediática esta realidad del pueblo nicaragüense.
Gracias, Berta. Berta just wants to add one thing on behalf of the other families. While we, of course, are demanding the freedom of all of the political prisoners, all of our loved ones, we also implore the regime that it adheres to the minimum standards for their treatment. We're talking about the Mandela rules here. So we urge all countries around the world to demand the same. Nicaragua is a very small country, but this is something of the utmost importance, and we encourage everyone around the world to stand with us in this fight. Thank you.
so much, everyone, for coming, and have a nice rest of the day. I can assure you, you will continue to hear from us going forward as we continue to fight for the release of Félix, Juan Sebastián, and all of Nicaragua's political prisoners.
Muchas gracias a todos por su participación y asistencia en la conferencia de prensa de hoy. Por supuesto, seguiremos en contacto en la lucha por la libertad de todos los presos políticos, incluso Juan Sebastián, Chamorro y Félix Maradiaga. Muchas gracias y que tengan un buen día.
Gracias.
Muchas gracias.